Yeah.
Everybody, well, again, thank you again for coming to our artist lecture series. You know, what's really important about these artist lecture series is it gives you all, the student, an opportunity to really kind of dive into the thought process of a professional artist like Kim Smith Claudel here, and introducing you all to contemporary art that is happening now, and all the changes that happen when an artist starts at a young age and matures into an aesthetic or a style. And what you see here is a very challenging show, you know. So again, thanks a lot for coming here. What I have here is some talking points that Kim gave me, and she didn't necessarily give it to me to give it to you all, but they were so interesting in their phrasing and their statement, right, that I thought it'd be good for you all to see, because these are the types of things artists think about with their work. So, you know, we'll touch on a few of these, but I gave it to you all because maybe when you hear us speak or hear Kim speak about some work, one of these phrases might pop out and you go, can you know, emphasize this phrase? So as we are looking or listening, you know, if there's something within this list that we didn't cover, you know, maybe that's a good way to ask a question. Okay, so, but I want first Kim to introduce herself, and go right ahead, Kim, and let me have a seat so I'm not the only one standing.
Great. You hear that? Okay. Thank you, Nathan. And thank you all for being here. It's so good to see you again. Some of you I talked to before, and I'm just really grateful to be here, and I'm really grateful that you're here. It really, you know, I think for artists, you spend a lot of time sort of being by yourself, making things, and what you're really most excited about a lot of times for me personally is being able to put it out in the world and actually share something, thinking of it as a point of connection between me and you. So thank you for being here, and for everyone at Mount Hood Community College. This is a really special place with amazing faculty. I'm very grateful. A little bit about me. I'm originally from Arizona. I feel like we both kind of share this desert feeling, and I think that's something that really shows up a lot in my work, kind of the sky, the colors, and those things. I left when I was 18 and actually moved up here to Oregon, and I studied at Oregon State and really fell in love with Oregon and just the beauty of it. I studied art from a young age. I was very obsessed with art. There were other things I liked, but that was kind of the thing. I was always drawing. I drew a lot. Drawing was my thing, and then painting, and that's what I did, and that's what I studied, that along with art history. And then after that, I sort of had a moment where I was maybe a little cynical or jaded about art and my career path within it, and feeling like there was a lot of pressure to go to graduate school, and feeling like there was just this narrow path of expectations, and I kind of was just a little itchy, and so I joined the Peace Corps, and I was in Africa for 2.5 years, and there was a little detour for me that ended up being very significant in my life, and I think that kind of started a period of detours that, you know, as an artist, for me personally, have been very flexible and moving with opportunities that came up. After that, I felt like I really lit a fire, actually, for me to go to graduate school, actually, and get very serious about making art. I made a lot of art when I was there, and I think I sort of had a different perspective about what it meant to create things, and that was really my core passion, and what that actually can do individually, but also socially. So I ended up going to graduate school at School of Visual Arts in New York, and I spent some time living there, and that was incredible. I studied fine arts, so it was a really open, interdisciplinary program, meaning you didn't have to say, like, I'm in painting or I'm in sculpture, and so I started doing drawing, actually, mostly drawing. I was doing really large drawings of actually MRI images of my body, and they were super big and super realistic and detailed, and then I kind of expanded from there into painting and sculpture, and that has kind of been the seed of where I'm at now. Post that, I sort of finished graduate school and didn't know what to do with that. And I ended up one summer after graduate school doing a lot of odd jobs, and it's kind of crazy, but I ended up replying to a Craigslist ad to be sort of this like artist assistant for a professor at MIT. And I took on that project for just 15 hours for $15 an hour. And I did that, and I worked really, really hard. And I helped this professor put on this show of drawings. And then that kind of opened up this whole other thing where I ended up then moving to Boston and working in the MIT Media Lab and deciding to then actually go back to school again and get a degree in media arts and sciences. And again, it's sort of like what I was saying before, it's like just kind of picking up all these things that are really useful. I think as artists, it's all about your toolkit. It's about all the odd jobs you have, it's about all the people you meet, it's about all the experiences you have and the places you go and how that kind of becomes your palette. And then I was there for a while and sort of got introduced to technology and the relationship between technology and art, and that has a lot of influence on my work today. And spent time there, did a lot of things, and then ended up here in Oregon, and have been very grateful to have a great community here, being a part of a couple artist groups that has been really useful for me to continue creating, having a dialogue and critiques, and then just carving out as much time as I can to make art.
Great.
Yeah.
And just for the record, everybody, me being up here talking was pretty much a request by Kim. So just letting you all know, it wasn't me who was like, I want to interview you. This was kind of a,
you know, I feel like when you give an artist talk.
I feel like, you know, I shouldn't be up here because, you know, Kim's going to be pretty much the star of all this. But so it's really kind of, we're trying to just kind of a dialogue here.
Don't worry, you're not your friend.
Oh, thank you. Thanks,
No, but I mean,
I appreciate that.
Nathan has so much to offer, and it's been so great just having conversations. And
Okay, well, I'm doing my best, but I think the first thing that kind of came to mind, and you know, you said so much there, when you mentioned how technology and your experience with that, and I'm assuming with the MIT internship, what do you mean by that? Because you know, when we look at your work here, it's visually, right, or I guess when you first glance it, that's not a part of it. And you just said that influenced this.
yeah.
And I think since a lot of our students here are animators, and of course, you know, we're all online and all that stuff. Yeah. Can you dive into that? Because I think there's a kind of a crossing point right now in this day and age between those two mediums of technology, and of course, with what you're doing, which is, you know, the object.
Yeah.
Can you discuss that a
that's
little
a great
bit?
question. I think of it as like kind of operating on two levels. Like the first, I think, you know, when I finished graduate school and all my friends were artists and everyone I knew was like good at painting and all that, I think I sort of took it for granted what it means to have like a creative practice and to make things and to use your hands, and what I loved about my process and the analog experience. And then when I ended up in a more technological field, people were very excited by art. They were sort of excited by what it means to actually make things with your hands and be physical. I think, you know, when you think about even today and technological tools and AI, what it really does is it makes us rethink about what it means to be an individual creating, what it means to like be human, what is so special about those things, and really calls attention. And so seeing it within that contrast was really eye-opening for me. I was really, really bad at all tech things, but then I had to adapt quickly because I needed to, you know, support myself. I needed to kind of, you know, get these different skills. And so in that process, starting to learn more technological tools, you know, I started doing graphic design, I started doing illustration. These are things that happen digitally. And when I think about what that does to my mind, it really changed my relationship with time. And I think probably a lot of you draw on your iPads or whatever, right? So, you know, that whole feeling of what it means to operate in that digital space. There's a time element that's so different than when you're in the real world. For example, you can't really go backward in the same way. You have this linear way, although I don't think of my painting process or my sculpture process as being so linear. In a way, it's like once you make the mark, for me, once the paint is there, it's sort of done. You can try and sort of undo things, but you're not moving through time in this different way. You don't have layers that are getting reconfigured. And I think also starting to see things in those layered ways and that relationship with digital time definitely affected how I thought about these things. And also what it means to kind of, relationships with color and presence. These things are all, I see a lot of influence with those technological tools. Hey, yeah?
There's also depth.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's hard to do that digitally unless you're using like CGI or something, but I'm talking about like in the real world.
Yeah.
Like things you could interact with and see plane to plane. That's also another advantage of doing things traditionally.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, and you can kind of build history in a way that's sort of different, There's like a dirtiness to the history too.
Do you see your installation or your work? I mean, I'm hearing that there's a kind of a duality between your making processes with what you do with work digitally and your installation work. Is there a conscious kind of real separation with doing digital work and then coming into a gallery and it being the real world you're playing with?
Yeah, sure.
Is
Yeah,
it
I think I see what you're saying there. And I mean, they do feel like different entities, but I think I've been trying to enter this phase of my life where I'm a little bit more holistic. I think there's been times where I felt like I was making these containers or separations within my practice and my professional life or this or that. And I'm realizing now that it's all the same, right? I'm the same person that shows up to do, the work that I do here or this job here for professional work or digital work or physical things. And so I've really been thinking more about how that's all connected. So it kind of, I see the through lines.
Okay, yep. So there is a relationship.
Yeah.
There is some sort of a collaboration between the two.
Oh,
it might
for
not
sure.
It might not be completely visual, but there is a relationship.
Yeah, and I think especially like graphic design, I don't know if any of you are studying graphic design, it's like, or even just basic formal 2D, 1D intro classes to design, you really start to think about things, a picture plane, a space, and formal elements start to be really important in this kind of graphic quality of, cutting and pasting, and those things are very influential too.
Number 8 is interesting because I think it can be very relatable to all of our students here, is a studio practice, right? Describe it and what it looks like. What we teach here are rather traditional processes, right? Mold making and of course painting and all that stuff. When we look at a work like this, when a young student looks at your, combining these objects, how would you describe your studio practice?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you about mine. Everyone's is very, very different.
Yes.
I have a space right now that's in my home, which is nice, good and bad. I really try to, so much of my process, I think, in my practice is trying to turn off certain parts of my brain and certain parts of my head. And, I think it's a lot of that kind of game in that space. So, there's like sort of habits I take on in that space. Like I always light some incense first. Then I listen to like binaural beats and sort of get in this headspace. I meditate. I don't have any food. I have lots of water. I do writing. I write for the first thing in the morning every single day. I write before my studio practice. I'm very intentional about what goes in my ears. I always have things that I'm looking at. And then I usually try to open up my studio practice with a very open and playful space. And I think this speaks maybe to another question on there about intention and what that means. I like the studio space as a place of discovery, a place of unknowing. I like that I go in there and I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm always just looking for a spark or like a feeling. Sometimes I'll go down the studio and I'll say, oh, I'm going to make a painting today, but then something else in the space calls to me. Maybe it's a material, maybe it's something else, something happens outside and I just go a completely different direction. And I think part of also what I'm trying to do with turning off part of my brain is also turning on another part of maybe it's not the brain, but the body, where you're always trying to find what that little spark is and what that excitement is, and kind of going with that intuition. So it's definitely grounded in intuition. That's something that I've been trying to embrace more and feel more connected to, and try to use that more as a strength. Does that answer your question?
Yes, no, yes. Does that intuition with materials happen with some sort of emotional reaction to an object that you find? Or is it more elemental, meaning that this is metal and I'm trying to do something speaking with metal, this is wood, I'm trying to, I guess is how does that intuition interact with you discovering an object and using it in the gallery?
Yeah.
Can you explain that process a little bit?
Yeah, I think intuition is really a key part of that too. I love materials. I love using lots of different materials. I tend to like a lot of materials that, I don't know what it is. I'm kind of, again, looking for that thing that grabs you. I think about presence a lot. I think about energy. I think about trying to shift and move energy through objects. A lot of things are pretty humble. A lot of things are found. I don't spend a lot of time at the art supply store. I spend more time collecting things that are free, garage sales or hardware stores. I think with media, I think of myself very much as a painter, but I was just talking to Dan about this. A lot of times that doesn't necessarily mean that there's paint involved. A lot of times there is, but a lot of times it means that there's other things that have color. There's light, there's these theater gels, there's, what does it mean to have like a painting that maybe doesn't last or is ephemeral? And so I'm always sort of looking for that thing that kind of turns on, or it is kind of energetic with objects, but knowing too that they also don't exist in isolation. It's really about that harmony and that symphony that they create together. And I think trying to find that in the most simple expression is really a challenge that I'm motivated by.
In the interview that you gave our Advocate, the newspaper here, you mentioned ego as or reacting to an ego.
Yeah.
Is that an ego of ability of manipulating material like the traditional artist has, with, I'm so good at portraiture, right? I mean, or is it ego in a sense of the viewer looking at the object and, I guess what I'm saying is, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Are you denying an ego with ability, or are you trying to redefine what an ego is with art and practice and talent?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much to say there. One big thing, there's an element of the ego that tends to get in the way for me. Maybe it's worrying about what the audience will think. Maybe it's about worrying what I'm doing. Maybe it's worrying about these things that are rooted in insecurity or even pride. And I think when I can get to a space where I'm letting go of that, it allows a more authentic self to come through. I think I really do value authenticity a lot in my work, because I feel like that is really the place of connection where you're going to create the best work, sort of ironically when you're not thinking of it that way. I've also been doing a lot of more spiritual journey too, and looking at consciousness and what all these things mean and how we're just all connected, and how you can kind of lose this sense of self when you're creating. It may feel like you're really in isolation and it's your own practice, but sometimes I feel like you're able to, as an artist, to gather something that's even outside of yourselves. Like it's something that we share, be it the collective consciousness or whatever. And I think that as an individual, that can be manifested or distilled through the artist. And I think it's just a way of another mental thing of letting go of the pride of self and the artist, and thinking about these things that kind of get in the way. And I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to collaborate with the work? What does it mean to really be collaborative to that thing that's more outside of myself? Yes?
Would you speak specifically a little bit about the casting in the corner?
Yeah.
Materials.
Can I ask Nathan a quick question, and then I'll return to that? I want to hear what your thoughts are on ego and the artist.
Oh, Lord. Well, it definitely gets in the way, in my opinion, because I have been making art for so long that there was a point where I think with a lot of artists where we're trying to develop some relationship with the material. And that material can be clay, glass, paint. So within that relationship of building skills, I think there's a moment where we tend to forget that are these skills that I'm learning true to my poetry? Yeah. Or am I following a blueprint of what I'm supposed to be doing? I think that when I started going into grad school and as a young student and seeing more art that was dealing with concept, possibilities, and of course changing paradigms of what art is, it opened my eyes to what ego is. Because I grew up in a very working class environment. I grew up in oil field. I grew up very, very, very working class, where there was people doing very technical things 8 hours a day. Yeah. There's people in India right now casting beautiful bronze deities by the hundreds daily. Whenever I went into the art world, I would meet some people that had that kind of egotistical, in a sense, look how good I am. And I would always remember the people that I would work with as a child and be like, well, people do this every day. There's awesome seamstresses, there's awesome, so that checked me a little bit about what ability really is, and poetry became more prominent. And how we express poetry is not how we dominate materials. Yeah. So I do think that I kind of had an opinion at some point in my mid-20s where when I was looking at the art that was famous, like the Jeff Koons and these kind of Damien Hirst, where I was seeing more of an enslavement of materials rather than an expression of those materials. Because I grew up in a very labor-intensive enslavement of people and materials. So when I saw a big, beautiful, puffy, chrome-plated silver sculpture that took $200,000 to cast, I was looking more at, wow, there's an enslavement of that material and not really a poetic dance with that material. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's what I think. So. Yeah,
no, I like that a lot. I think what you're saying about the word you used, dominance, is really an interesting one. Yeah, sort of forcing materials to
a point, yeah. And I think we all at a young age, I think we need to dance with materials and really understand what it can do. Yeah. So I'm not saying that attempt is not something that can be used later on, but I do think as an artist advances, that those concepts need to be considered. One thing that I think a lot of my students, a lot of these are beginning level students, and some of them are actually just taken as an elective, but number 22 is installation art. Talk about installation art, and what does installation art mean, in your opinion, Kim? Because that is a very broad word when we say installation art.
Yeah.
How do you define that?
I didn't forget about your question, Saber.
Yeah, Saber. I'm sorry, Saber. We'll go back to that soon.
Okay, we'll go back to that after the big question. Yeah, I think, I've been working on some paintings recently that are just like paintings on canvas, and they have this boundary, right? It's like a rectangle, it's on canvas, it's stretched, and I'm realizing that as a boundary is really interesting in relationship to coming off of this show, which is more of an installation-based show, and seeing that. I think my biggest epiphany around that was feeling as though installation was this infinite space, like you can kind of go anywhere. And that is both liberating, but it's also can feel challenging as well. I've always loved painting, but sort of felt like it sometimes just didn't do all the things that I wanted it to do, in particular, occupy your space in a way, have more of a relationship with the body that really did feel as though it was in your space, in the way that like a sculpture really can feel different as opposed to like an illusionary space. And thinking kind of the space as collective, as this being the entire canvas, and as opposed to a container for other little canvases. One thing that's really been on my mind in my practice for a couple of years now is like ephemerality. And I think that installation art is something that really embraces that, or does it in a way that is easier. I think we've got sort of with other practices, be it like, painting or bronze sculpture, there's this feeling of this has to last. I'm going to cast this big thing so that it lasts, and it outlives me, and it, can live on and all these things. And I think with the installation art, we don't always carry that expectation, and so you can let go and really embrace more of like a moment that a show can exist. Like today at 4, I'm just gonna pack this all up, and a lot of these materials will just go home, and there'll be more materials that maybe get reconfigured in a different way. I think the element of, I was saying earlier about my studio practice being about discovery and not knowing, kind of showing up to this gallery and not knowing is a big part of the installation work for me. That's really terrifying, and I wouldn't recommend it always, when you have limited time and you have to kind of perform in a way, but I find that it's really exciting to feel as though you're actually collaborating with the space and responding to it.
Number 18, the mental game of creating. I think that's interesting because, we all have ways of finding inspiration, ways of finding time, and all these things that take away from making art, survival. But what do you think that means? Is there a mental game? Is there a mental state of mind that you think the artist has to get into? Like you said, you put music on, you burn incense. Is that what you think it means?
Yeah, I think it's also what I mean about turning off certain parts of my brain. I think we all maybe feel sometimes a little too self-conscious or insecure, or your head starts getting involved, but you think about times where you've been in a flow state, or even when you're a kid, where those things aren't really there, and yet you're able to get to a place that's really exciting and create strong work. I think once you've developed a body of skills and you've kind of learned a few things, you know how to mix paint, you know how to make the thing, those kind of slip away and they just become something that happens automatically and they're subconscious, and that's a great place to be because then you can enter into more of maybe like a beginner's mindset, which I think is always a great place to be. And that's another reason why I like to shift materials. Maybe if you make a painting with a different kind of materials instead of something I'm very skilled at, then I'm a little clumsy and I have to figure out things and it feels a little fresh and it feels a little awkward, and maybe I really like that awkwardness, There's this human element that feels exciting and authentic. And I can talk about it a little bit in relationship to this piece called Holding My Breath that Saber asked about. I think this is a good example of,
we're talking about the resin piece right here with the
resin bloom?
Uh-huh.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Could be.
it's the resin balloon, yeah. This is a good example, I think, of maybe related to what you were saying earlier about the ego. If you have certain ideas in your head about, I want it to be this thing, and I was doing this really hard, and I was just really controlling this process very much so. I had been doing these balloons that actually had started as a complete accident, and it was in my show previous to this, but I basically was painting on these balloons, these latex balloons that were inflated, and then as time would pass, the air would seep out, and then this kind of skin would emerge, and it was this kind of wrinkled, deformed, lace-like, very beautiful as, a representative metaphor, like a real image of a balloon, when the party's over and they were hanging and all this stuff. And I really wanted to juxtapose that ephemerality with something lasting, like, cast it into resin. And I know nothing about resins. This is a great example of, not knowing about a craft, but I was like, I really want to cast them. And so I had this balloon, I had inflated it, with my breath, and I had this vision, I wanted it to hang in the resin, and I made a couple others that were just a mess, and resin is expensive and all this stuff. But I made a lot of mistakes, and I think what was exciting about this piece was, this particular mistake really, so I poured it, and then the heat trapped it and pushed the air out and actually split the resin into two pieces, and then it becomes this really sharp, clear, hard line, and it becomes these two perfectly bisected halves, and it just really opened up from there. And I had been holding so tightly to what I wanted it to be and trying to learn this technical skill, and then it just was like completely a failure, and I was upset at first, and then I looked at it and I was like, wow, I really, really love this, and it's really beautiful. And people a lot of times talk about like, oh, it's happy accidents, and I sort of hate that phrase. like you're not making accidents, you're not failing in the studio. Everything is an experiment. It's just trying to attune your mind to being like suppressing that ego and letting go of that pride. So when something beautiful and magical happens, you're able to receive it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. And notice it. No, go right ahead.
Along the same lines, like a lot of times a blank canvas can be intimidating and really daunting, like where to start, because you have so many creative ideas and you really want it to flow. So you kind of, I heard you kind of remove some of the things in your brain so that you can really hone in on what you want to do. But do you ever gamify that to really remove certain things? Like, I'm going to only paint in blue today, or I'm going to only like kind of gamify it so that you can force yourself into a more creative state, or do you keep it really discovery oriented and keep it wide?
That's a great question. I'm going to have like two components of that answer. So the first, yes, I think games, as you say, I think of it as limitations, but I've been trying to reframe that word into opportunities. This show is a great example. It came up really fast. I wasn't really ready for it. I love it now, so I feel confident saying that in front of you now, but it was a real moment of panic, and so I had all these things, like I didn't have a lot of time, X, Y, Z. And so instead of seeing those as, oh, I can't make giant oil paintings because I don't have time to dry, and I can't do this and that, it's sort of like, okay, great, now you've cut off certain things. So limitations can be really, really, really helpful because they really narrow that boundary and you can work and be free within them. Just like an assignment. Assignments are so much easier than being alone in your studio, right? Like even though you may hate them, but you can be creative within that playground. The second part I'd say to that is, kind of what I was saying about the mental tricks. I'm always trying to play these tricks in my mind because, a blank canvas is terrible. Going to the studio not having a plan is terrible. And so I have a couple strategies that have helped me. I always work on multiple pieces at once so that there's no, how can I lower the stakes? A lot of times I always use really inexpensive materials, like in graduate school, I was doing drawings on newspaper, largely because I had no money, but also because I was always buying the oops paints. But that really helped me because as soon as I started using expensive materials, I hated doing that because it felt precious. And it felt like, oh, I can't mess this up. And so having a lot of materials going at once, a lot of pieces going at once, it's like if you get stuck here, then I can just go over here. And then if I get stuck there, I can come back here. And then time has passed, and then you learn things from other pieces.
Number 16, starting a work. And when is it finished in your sense of process? Because when I was observing you install, there was a moment where you had everything laid out on the ground, or some way, not everything, but certain parts, and you were making decisions. So for instance, this piece over here, which I think is the most formal piece, and I say formal with balance and negative space and positive space, when is something like that done, in your opinion, finished? How do you tell these students, when is a stopping point?
Yeah. That's a hard question. I think a lot of artists wrestle with it, and I'd love for you to answer that after I talk a little bit about it. I feel like you just kind of know, and if you have to ask if it's finished, then it's probably not. If I don't know and I don't really know what else to do, I always walk away and I just let it simmer. I let it have some time because I'll change, it'll change, my perception will change, and I come back and then I'll either know and I'll know exactly what to do, or sometimes it even just falls apart. I also have a practice of asking the work what it wants, I actually do that. I sort of, sometimes I'll touch it and I'll just like, what do you want? And I kind of try to ask it and see what it says. And sometimes it tells me something. And again, I'm always trying to short circuit that, like what I hear, what I see, and then go with it. I think that initial impulse before you have to think about it and what does it mean and if I could just do it, I find that being a really generative space. This piece, for example, I don't think I had the moss thing here when I was assembling it. And that was just something I brought the next day because when whatever it wasn't feeling like it was done and it needed that specific element, and it sort of popped in my head, and then I brought it the next day, for example.
So completing some of this work is rather, well, it's not arbitrary, but it's just a moment. It's just a moment when and it's unexplainable, some of these moments, but
yeah.
Is it instinctual? And I like to tell my
so.
students that there's an instinct of knowing when your work is done. And that's why you make a lot of bad work for a long time, is because at some point there will be an instinctual moment where you'll know that's it.
Yeah.
That's how I would answer that. My process is kind of instinct,
Yeah,
Yes.
and you can make mistakes. Like there's a lot of times where I've been wrong and I ruin. And kind of what I was saying earlier about like digital processes, like you can maybe undo it, but I ruin work all the time.
Yeah, me too. Ash, go right ahead.
Do you ever start your pieces with an idea of what you want them to look like at the end, or is it all just sort of vibes as you go along, figuring it out?
More the latter, I would say.
Could you repeat that for the video?
Yeah, I believe your question was do you have an intention when you start, like a plan of where it's going to be, or is a lot of it figuring it out through vibes as you go along?
Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes I have, I like to think of it as like like a North Star or like a thread. Sometimes I want to hold on to something, even if it's just small. It could be a phrase, it could be a single material. Maybe it's back to what we were saying about having some boundary, something that's there. And then I do really love the process of venturing into the unknown. And I think a lot of art making for me is decision making, and sort of like a game or a dance. You do one thing and then you're at a place and then you have to decide what you're going to do after that. And then you don't know what that next step will be because you haven't gotten there yet. And then you decide from there. And so that kind of non-linear, messy process is really exciting for me. Yes?
Kind of tying to the game idea, another big part of art is revision along the way, like starting without trying to map everything out directly, all perfectly. You start with a little sketch and then you build off of that, and you build off of that, and then you tweak this, you tweak that. And the way I do art, at least, I want my sketch to look just as good as my finished drawing. Not literally, but in the essence that everything's there, and all I need to do is polish it and ink it, color it, the basic stuff, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Even talking about like sketches versus if you then go and rework it. And
I find I get a lot better results when I tweak along the way rather than create these guidelines that are supposed to be a silver bullet and try to get it right the first time every time.
Yeah.
When that's not really how art works.
Yeah.
And I think that's a difference a lot with art and a lot of design processes, right? With design, you really kind of have an end goal, right? And that goal could be a client or something you're selling. And I think with art, like what you're saying, is you get an idea, but you allow some room for that process to change and evolve. Yeah.
That's a good point, thanks.
What does
questions?
tender to the? Oh, I'm sorry. Go right ahead. That's okay.
Well, you were going to talk about the names. I was going to say, how do you name your pieces?
Yeah.
And when do the names come to you?
Yeah, I've always hated naming pieces, and I, for many years, would be there untitled, and that just didn't feel right to me either. I work abstractly a lot, not always, but a lot, and so I think that that can give a real importance and significance to words. A lot of my work is sort of outside of thinking about words or how I'm going to linguistically explain this. You know, I'm using kind of other communication methods. So I've taken sort of an approach that I think of kind of like photography, where you can go out and take from what exists, and I've been pulling from things that I'm reading at that moment, whatever is kind of in my, you know, I'm always trying to curate whatever's my palette for that time period, and so I think being able to take fragments has been very helpful for me, because it's things that I'm hearing and ingesting, but being able to see then matching it to how I'm feeling about a specific work, and always after, because I don't know the thing until I think it's done, and so that is something I've been doing and really enjoying that as a process as well. And the name for the show just kind of was the only thing that was in my head. It was sort of how I was feeling emotionally, and I thought it had a lot of resonance with, you know, a physical injury, or I'm a very sensitive person and I feel like I can break at any moment in a lot of ways, and maybe a lot of you as art people feel that way, and kind of that came from sort of a broader investigation conceptually into like hard and softness, which I've been thinking about as feeling like a very soft person in a way, and trying to find that strength within that, especially when that can feel at odds with the world that we're in.
Any more questions?
Did you have a question, Saber?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask, because this is a departure from the last couple of shows, mine included, because there's no prices on this show. And so, how do you sell your work? Where is it sold? And how do you reconcile the economy?
Sure. Was there a piece that you were looking at buying, Saber?
The shattered resin balloons. Obviously my favorite.
Yeah, I just never really, I mean, I work very, very hard to try and balance it all and, you know, pay my expenses and all that. It's a struggle and I hate it, but it's also a useful friction in my life. But I just sort of never wanted to put the pressure of selling work or mixing commerce with my artwork. I'd love it if people bought my things, and that would be great, but it's never really been my focus. And a lot of times my work does tend to go places that aren't very commercial. And, you know, in my previous show before this, I think I was really confronting that in a lot of ways, what it means to be a lasting object, like I mentioned before, in this kind of commercial world that we live in, and like just letting go of it, because realizing that, you know, I'm excited about having it exist in a moment. That moment is shared with you. I don't have to have it last forever in my lack of storage space, and kind of letting go of that burden of having to sell it, for me, it's been really rewarding. But if you want to buy anything, it's always an option. But it's not the motivating factor, you know. And I think that you know, we don't always have to make commercial objects. You had another question.
I just wanted to ask specifically about the bits, bytes, atoms, and eves. How did you come up with that?
Oh, I actually came up with that myself. It was just from a poem I had been writing. I do write a bit.
Yeah, what's the question one more time?
I was just asking about number 6, this wall. The name is bits, bytes, atoms, and eves.
Oh, a piece in the show, yes.
Yes, it was just came out of my mouth so good. It felt so fun to say that I needed to ask about it.
Oh, thank you. I like that. Yeah, I liked saying it too. It kind of came up organically. Like I had been writing a poem and thinking a lot about bits and bytes, kind of connected to the technology piece, and I do some work and had a bit of a background in like studying computation, and was really interested in computation as a way of reducing and abstracting information into, you know, bits and bytes. So if you think of this binary relationships of things, and thinking then about kind of the messiness and complexities that, you know, are exciting about us, are exciting about art, and all those things, and so that kind of duality with the black and white has been a central theme.
Any other questions, anybody? Go right
Hey.
ahead, Alana.
I want to know, is the one behind you a whale? orca.
Oh,
The one that's on the wall.
Yeah, I think it can be what you want, whatever you see in it. I never saw a whale, I never saw an orca, but I love that you did, and I think that's one of the things that are exciting about working abstractly is like there's kind of this half open space for you to see a whale in it, and now I'll see that too, and I think that I hadn't been thinking about anything specific like that, but the answer is yeah, it's all those things.
I see a rock, like a giant bolt, across like a horizon line.
I don't.
What about the role of waste? And you actually want to hear when does trash become art, right?
Yeah.
Is there a overarching commentary on is there environmentalist commentary here? Do you want people to take something of that away in a sense of like a commentary on the waste? Because when I see some of these objects that are found and utilized in your sculpture, I think of Jean Baudrillard's essay, the System of Objects, right? And when we see an object, some of us are so programmed in a sense to see that object as trash when that object has a system of before and after, how it was made, why it was created, what's the intention, what that object was created for, tin foil. I'm looking at the strips of wood. That is a metaphor of logging industry, stuff like that. And that's the way I observe objects in my own kind of aesthetic.
Yeah.
But what does the waste aspect of our society, how does that play a role?
Yeah.
Or does it play a role?
No, it does. I mean, I think all of it plays a role, right? It's all of it's happening all the time, and it's always getting into your psyche as an artist. I don't usually say like, oh, I'm making work and it's about this social commentary, but I do personally feel very overwhelmed by waste as an artist. And I think I've heard a lot of my artist friends sort of saying something similar to the effect, and I think it's just sort of all of it. At some point you get very tired of feeling as though you're collecting all this packaging and all this waste and feeling like you're in this system where it's very challenging not to, and like buying new art materials, buying new clothing, it starts to have a real burden, and there's something about newness that can feel I've just been reconsidering it and feeling less excited and also feeling a little guilty about it, quite truthfully. A lot of the things that are trash, I kind of like this compressing of these different states. So thinking of fine, beautiful materials, but also trash, and like, what's the real difference? Is there a real difference? And also just being awake and attuned to those sensitivities of the things that I find, quite frankly, I find very beautiful. And a lot of the things, like in this piece, for example, has a lot of what you could call it trash, but they're all objects that really called to me for some reason, and I found were really beautiful, and together in a certain way were really beautiful. And also artifacts. I think a lot about artifacts of our time and these things that are disposable and do get thrown away, and they're not meant to last. But maybe they also have a history that I want to hold on to as well. I think most everything in here has sort of a history to it. It had a purpose before this idea of selecting from existing things like you would as a photographer. I think that really calls to me, this idea of scraps being the thing rather than the thing that you cut out of the fabric.
Yeah,
how do you feel about that?
Well, I think there's something about the mundane and the lost and the forgotten and the neglected.
Yeah.
Which is the content that I kind of take from some of this stuff. I mean, the balloon's a good example, and the little stringer that's used for celebratory systems on the wire there, because when the consumer looks at the balloon, they see birthday party. They see celebratory when they were children. And then when that moment is done, it's immediately thrown out. Yeah. So there's kind of a non-commitment to the feeling of the balloon and my birthday. And then once my birthday's done, that feeling I had is disposed in the trash, and everything that happened to create that balloon, all the systems of chemicals and mining and industry and all that, for a second of a moment, and now it's discarded. And I think that's a great metaphor for people and poverty and political issues, right? So when I look at the arisen piece, I take, in a sense, the way I look at work is there is a moment of capturing that celebratory moment in an attempt to solidify it with an object that is designed to be disposed.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a design to dispose your emotions in a way. So you can buy more stuff to celebrate that emotion, and then that emotion is disposed. So that system of objects comes in a sense of when I look at your work, the disposal of that piece of wood there. But to make that strip of wood is an intricate industrial process. Even though it's a mundane stick, if you really knew what it took to create that, and of course, not even speaking about the tree that was used to create that, which was a life form.
Yeah.
I think that's what I look at when I look at your work, is I start to dissect, there's a frame that the gallery provides. And that then takes me into the last thing, because it's almost time for us to go, is the role of the Southwest. And when I was thinking about number 15, what role does the American Southwest play in your work? Trash looks different in the Southwest than it does in the Northwest.
It does.
When you have a barren landscape and you see a bag from Walmart that says thank you blowing in the wind, there's a certain framing that the Southwest provides, and the gallery is almost a desert in itself. So I really enjoyed that when you said that. We talked about being from the Southwest. The gallery is a desert. It's a visual desert. It's a conceptual desert. It's a blank space, right? So the way that you're framing these materials reminds me of that, what connects that Southwest, because when I was growing up and you saw an old oil can from the 1970s that had it moved and from that rock, and there's people walking by and traffic going by, but there's something about there's nothing in that landscape but blue sky, red ground, and that can has a presence.
Totally.
So anyways, that kind of leads me into that part, but yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered that question, but definitely
Beautiful,
the way that I look at the role of the Southwest, and you made me really kind of think about the gallery as a desert, and not just a visual kind of blank space, but conceptually, mentally, the gallery's a desert. And students, this is what happens when you frame a material in a gallery. You focus upon it, and then it's conceptualized.
Yeah.
So, want to add to that?
I think that was really beautiful. I've never thought of it in those exact words, and I love that. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Does anybody else have any questions before we go? Well, Kim, I think you gave my students quite a bit to think about, and we really appreciate you and the time that you've given us today, and your comments. And everybody, if you have any comments for Kim after the talk, please let her know. Is there any way that we can look at your work, follow your work? Are there any exhibits or shows coming up that we need to know about?
Sure. I have one nearby in October at Carnation Contemporary, and one in Seattle at the Vestibule, if you're up there, in October. But I have a website. It's kimsmithclaudel.com. I'm sort of sometimes barely on Instagram. But I would love to, if you have any questions or want to talk, it's just such a pleasure to be here and to meet you, and I'm really excited for you all, because it's exciting to be doing art, and it's a beautiful, important thing to be doing in the world. So keep at it.
Right. Thanks, Kim. Appreciate it.